And about 3 o'clock that morning, which was the 2nd of May, the battalion commander called me in and says, I want you to take Dai Do. And God bless the Echo Company had never lost a damn battle. And he said, you guys have got to do it. Otherwise, I'm going to lose this. Golf company's probably going to be wiped out. The other companies are really hurt, so I don't have anyone that has the capacity to do this. So at 5 o'clock that morning, I got Echo. All the orders were issued. The platoon commander's ready to go. Squad leaders ready to go. We fixed bayonets, and nothing like the sound of 180 bayonets at 5 o'clock in the morning with all this haze over a rice paddy. And we went down range and we took Dai Do, and I had 180 Marines, and unfortunately we took it, but we took a lot of losses. We had about 14 or 15 killed, but after that battle was over, I had only 35 walking Marines. But I got my draft notice in '61, and I was thinking about going in the Army at the time, but a young individual who was a friend of mine had just sort of flunked out of, if you will, West Point. And he was telling me about his experiences at West Point, and he handed me a little 3x5 card when I got my draft notice, and I mailed it in. It was to the U.S. Marine Corps. And a good-looking major in his dress blues came up from Birmingham, Alabama, and interviewed me at the student union at Auburn University. And I looked at the uniform and didn't know a damn thing about the Marine Corps. And I said, I like that uniform. That guy was a big jock, and I like to work out. He looked very fit. And I said, if I got to go, I want to be one of you guys. Well, I first went to Vietnam in '63 and '4, and Vietnam was just starting to crank up a little bit. And our first experiences, we got aboard, our battalion got aboard Navy ships, and we got off at Da Nang about 60 miles and drove holes in the ocean there for a couple of months. And we would just go in as observers. There were a few advisors in, and there was a helicopter squadron in, which was really the first unit of the Marines that went in. And we'd go in and go on little patrols with these observers. And the only real shooting was going on was with the VC. And the only reason I used to tell the story, the only reason these guys got combat pay, they'd go out and shoot a couple of holes and sign to the post office, and they could get combat pay based on a couple of rounds going through the sign at the post office. But I went back in '67 and '68, and it was totally different ball game. Back then, I recall it was a pretty country, and that's really all I knew about it, other than casual observations. But I went back in '67 and '68, and the war was really cranking up. Right. And, I was hearing and meeting all these kids coming back, all these young officers, and certainly all the young Marines. And the war was just cranking. And so the first, I got there, and I think it was September '67, and they put me aboard a helicopter. And I went out to join my company, and the company just had their ass handed to them. And they were all beat up, and the company commander had done a very poor job in leading his Marines, so they're not in good shape. But I was there for 9 hours, and they said, you going into combat. I mean, I was on the ground 9 hours. I didn't even know who my first sergeant was. And they called me in the battalion headquarters and gave me an order to go in what is called the Ashall Valley, which is one of the toughest places in Vietnam. And it's where all the helicopters got shot down. And I mean, the whole place was littered in helicopters. And they said, get your company ready to go. I didn't know who even my damn lieutenants were. And I'm calling these guys in to give them a combat order. And they looked at me and said, we're really going to do this? Because they had issued 50% of the company where they issued body bags to take with us. So that was my introduction to Vietnam in '67. And certainly I stayed in there for that tour for 9 months until I got shot up. My role as a company commander, I was responsible for leading a Marine company. There's 4 Marine companies in each Marine battalion at that point, after battalion. And my responsibility was to be prepared to train, organize, and be prepared to lead that Marine company in Vietnam. And I had Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, affectionately called the Magnificent Bastards. And essentially that was my job. And my biggest job was to get them squared away. And I spent all my time trying to lead these young Marines and trying to get them prepared as far as their equipment, their motivation, and their abilities to really get involved in a big fight. I knew at some point, I thought maybe we would get in a big fight. And that I was absolutely correct. And my first experiences were fighting a VC and getting them all engaged with just enough combat to get them sort of motivated and let them understand combat. So I spent all my time training, and we got in some pretty serious fights, but nothing like we would get into when I became a recipient of the Medal of Honor. And I had two things in mind, and I always focus on this. And when I talk to young Marine officers or military guys, I had two things I wanted to do. I wanted to do the mission. I wanted to bring them home. And so I was a tough son of a bitch on bringing that home part of it. So that meant they had to have their equipment square. They had to be physically fit. We had to take care of them, and they had to be trained. And they understood that I was there when we got in a fight to win. And we never lost a fight the whole time I was there. So that was my motivation. I really tried to impart on these young men. It's not about going to combat. It's also about bringing them home. And so every time I think about one of those I lost in combat, I think about what should I have done where I could have brought that young Marine home. So those two things were my motivation. Yeah, you go through all this training, but until you hear the buzz going by your head, you don't understand that experience. But the thing is, the key to that first buzz, that first experience, is as a company commander, and it sort of goes away what's going on around you as far as the bullets. You're concerned about what do you do as a leader to make sure those young Marines are effective in combat. And that was your motivation, that, take care of them, do the mission. And I recall the first ones going by my head, it was a real resounding experience.
Right.
Yeah. But we went through this whole process, and God bless us. We were just initially involved in VCs with the VC, and I was able to train up Marines. Then we became, I almost went to Hawaii City, but they pulled us out before Hawaii City broke. We became what is called a Special Landing Force Battalion. And we went down to Subic Bay to get reconfigured, retrained, put us aboard Navy ships, and brought us back. And they landed us just north of the Qua Viet River, which is, if you go up to the northern part of South Vietnam, the area we were called, was called I Corps, sort of between the Qua Viet, between the Ben Hai River, which was split between North and South Vietnam. And then there, it was not Viet Cong. It was the big boys, the North Vietnamese. And so we began to having small contacts with the NVA, and it gradually picked up. For some reason, it became more noticeable. The size of the units were getting better. And we were pretty successful against the NVA. We lost some Marines, but we always come out on the good side of the battle. And then we got into the battle, this battle of Dai Do, which I got the medal. And what happened was we were really the only American force of any size on the northern side of the Qua Viet River, which is about 2 miles from the big base called Dong Ha, Vietnam. And that was the big resupply base for all what was called a trace, which was Con Thien, Khe Sanh, and all those bases up in that area, which is called the old McNamara line. And also the 3rd Marine Division headquarters was there. So what happened was we started hitting some contacts, but they were not developing. And there was one bridge that was very critical to this operation along Route 1. So they initially took me there to provide security for that bridge. And then the other companies began to start making major contacts. And one of the companies got pinned down in what is called the village of Dai Do. And again, we had no idea of the size of the force. And they got pinned down, and as we call it in the Marine Corps, they chopped me back from the division. I got back to the battalion. I rejoined the battalion, and the first thing that I witnessed, a company had attempted to join this other company, which was Goff, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, which was on the edge of the village, and try to make a push to go through the village. And they got basically wiped out going across the rock. And they all withdrew. There was all kind of dead and wounded Marines on the battlefield. And I helped get all those Marines back. And about 3 o'clock that morning, which was the 2nd of May, the battalion commander called me in and says, "I want you to take Dai Do." And God bless the Echo Company had never lost a damn battle. And he said, you guys have got to do it. Otherwise, I'm going to lose this. Golf company's probably going to be wiped out. The other companies are really hurt, so I don't have anyone that has the capacity to do this. So at 5 o'clock that morning, I got Echo. All the orders were issued. The platoon commander's ready to go. Squad leaders ready to go. We fixed bayonets, and nothing like the sound of 180 bayonets at 5 o'clock in the morning with all this haze over a rice paddock. And we went down range, and we took Dai Do, and I had 180 Marines, and unfortunately, we took it, but we took a lot of losses. We had about 14 or 15 killed, but after that battle was over, I had only 35 walking Marines. But we took Dai Do and linked up with Hotel Company, had Dai Do consolidated, and I don't know how many of those guys we killed. I mean, there was so many of them in there, no one could count. And another company came around my left flank called Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. Had only about 70 Marines left, and they went about 250 yards. And they got surrounded, and they kept hollering. They had 2 young lieutenants, and they were fairly new to the battalion. Their company commander had been wounded. I knew the 2 kids, and I was sort of the senior man there, and I just looked at the Marines, and I said, you guys don't have to go. I'm going up and help Hotel Company. All the Marines went with me, and we joined up with Hotel Company, and we slugged it out there for about an hour and a half, just going over from berm to berm, almost like World War II. When you think about the hedgerows in World War II, off of D-Day, off of the beaches, we were doing that same thing. And I mean, it was nasty stuff for about an hour and a half. And we were pushing those guys back. And later, I didn't realize their circumstance. We were in a village, and we were about to push them out in the open, and had all these helicopters, had all this artillery, all this fixed wing and naval gunfire. So those guys were really fighting for their life. But I don't know how many thousands we had boxed up in that corner. And those guys were really fighting like a son of a gun. And we slugged it out, running out of ammunition, and it got real nasty there for a while. I mean, real nasty. And they finally wounded me. I got hit a number of times with artillery shrapnel. Then we came across one of the berms, and this North Vietnamese was manning one of these 50 caliber or 51 caliber, I think, anti-aircraft machine guns that were shooting at our airplanes. And this guy turned it on me and shot me through the leg and almost blew my leg off. And at this time, all the Marines sort of witnessed the fact that I was the senior man and I was down. And, you know, the little panic, I was the old guy. I was all of 28 years old, but I was still the old guy. And they saw me go down, so a little panic began to set in. So I looked at 2 young lieutenants, and I had one young lieutenant left in my company, and said, you guys pull back, leave me here with all the weapons, and I'll hold these damn guys off till you get the hell out of here, because I'm down. And the 2 black Marines, both of them wounded, grabbed me up and said, Skipper, we're not leaving you. And so we sort of disconnected from the bad guys, fought our way back, got all our wounded Marines, took them with us, took the KIs with us. Had a number of KIs, and every Marine was basically dragging either a dead Marine or a wounded Marine to pull out of there. And I was shot and then medevac to the ship, and I got my first operation aboard the ship. And then they spent about 3 days aboard the LPH, which was a helicopter carrier. And then they medevac me to a triple hospital in Hawaii, and I spent about 3 months in the hospital. I had about 7 operations on my leg because it was so beat up. And they finally sent me back to Okinawa. I had a little bit of time left on my trip because we were required to stay 13 months in those time frames. And they finally sent me home after 13 months of being in the Far East. So I have a lot of time in the Orient.
What goes through your mind when you get wounded? I know it's something that you always, I'm assuming it's always in the back of your mind it can happen. Yeah. What goes through your mind when it actually does happen? You find yourself in that position.
Well, I tell you, I think you fall back on your training and your commitment to the people that you're involved in. You have to wipe out the circumstances of combat and focus on what the job is, what the mission is, and to bring the home part. And the reason I emphasize that, I always took it personal, and I always still take it personal. Every time you lose a Marine, you wonder, what in the hell did I not do this time? Because you had to look at them, you had to think about their parents and all that. This was sort of after the fact. And you can't think about this when this stuff is going on, but you always think about it after the battle. And I associated myself with a number of battles up to that point. And I always thought about that. And, it's sort of what goes through your mind afterwards, because you're too focused on what's happening in the actual engagement at that time. But afterwards, when it sort of settles in over you and you start thinking about all that. And the first thing you always do is you have a memorial service to make sure you extend the mercy of God to all these young Marines and sailors that got killed. And after that, you sort of begin to go through this mental process, and it never totally wipes out of your mind. It's always embedded there. Even it was 1968, and I'm 80 years old now. But that sort of image, death, combat, the bad guys, all the incoming, I mean, it's there, and it's what it is. It imprints on your mind. You just gotta, if you're gonna live your life, that's the reason a lot of the kids with PTS, they can't go beyond that. You just have to have the mental strength to go beyond that and attempt to live your life with that in the back of your mind, but you have to live your life. And everyone can't manage that. And unfortunately, I've been able to manage that. But as you get older, ironically, and you're not as committed, you're not working in all these things, you have to deal with it a little bit more. And you find even World War II guys, it begins to impact them. And I mean, these guys are 80, 90, 100 years old, and it begins to impact the Korean guys, Vietnam guys. So it's a matter of still keeping yourself mentally engaged, but it's there. And you have to raise your family. And I continued in the Marine Corps, so I've dealt with that all my life. And as I've got older, sometimes it's tougher to deal with. Vietnam was not over for me. I went back again in '74, and when I was leaving, going back, my wife, we had our first kids, a couple of years old, and she said, "You're not going back to Vietnam, are you?" I said, "Hell no, the war's over." And I was there for 14 days, and they put me aboard a command ship called the USS Blue Ridge. And they sent me south, and that's the point was, they saw the issues with Vietnam were really coming unglued. Nixon, had been removed from being the president. We had this program going where we were just simply supporting the Vietnamese and then do the fight. We had a few advisors and helicopters still in country. So I went out and what unfortunately they told me to do, the senior leadership was perceptive enough to know the way the things were, the political winds were blowing in Washington and the way things were happening with the Vietnamese. It's something we were probably going to have to pull out of there. And so my task was to plan for the evacuation of Vietnam, of all the American forces. So I got down and the thing began to unfold, the North Vietnamese attack going south towards Saigon. And I watched this, and the Vietnamese people certainly began to understand that. And a lot of them started pulling off in these small boats offshore. And we had a number of Navy ships, and we used to pick them up. And a lot of units had just got out of combat, and we'd pick them up and put them aboard these Navy ships. And that's called the RVN evacuation. But we still continued to plan for the evacuation of all the Americans, which were primarily concentrated around Saigon, and also the evacuation of the Cambodian joint U.S. military contingent that was in Cambodia. And so I was involved in all that planning. And finally, we had done the RVN evac. We was watching the North Vietnamese just pile down South Vietnam going towards Saigon. And finally, we saw the tea leaves, and everyone saw it except the ambassador. The ambassador wouldn't call for the evacuation. And finally, I'd been doing all this planning, and I was caught in country. The only way we could get in country, I'd have to get in civilian clothes, get aboard a CIA helicopter to go in country. We couldn't go in our uniform. because we had this big contingent of people from Poland, all these people that were observers, or quote, watching what was going on in Vietnam. And I got caught in country, and I was handed the execute message for Operation Frequent Wind. So I had to call the commander general and the regimental commander that was aboard ship and said, I've been handed the ambassador's agreed. The evacuation has to go down because the North Vietnamese are at the edge of Saigon. It has to go. And we have to get the people out. And I called for the option, and I've been planning all that. I had options from just getting the Americans out to evacuating 1 million Vietnamese. And I said, we just don't have time to get all these people out. We don't have the assets. We don't have the lift assets. And the president said, we got to get totally out of Vietnam. So I called for the option to bring in the forces to provide for the security and the helicopters to begin to flow to pull all the people out of Saigon. And Phnom Penh had gone down before then to pull out of Cambodia. So we started pulling all the people out of Saigon. And I watched the last 2 Marines get killed the night before we did the evacuation. A rocket hit a motorcycle they were sitting on and killed the last 2. And their bodies, unfortunately, were left in country. And that's Kennedy got those out of the country. And we went through this evacuation process. And I don't know how many missions, but the Marine pilots flew for 16 hours, pulling people, Marines, pulling civilians, Army, Air Force, all these people out of Vietnam. And we were located very close to Tan Son Nhut. But the force landed, and I sent a platoon over to the American embassy to help reinforce the embassy. And we began flowing from the embassy and flowing from that location, getting people out of Vietnam, picking people all over Saigon. I'm sure you saw the helicopters on top of buildings. And so we began pulling people back to the location, which is Westmoreland's old headquarters, and pulling all these people out of Vietnam. And we finally got their word. The president says, you to get the hell out of here, or I'm turning off the helicopters. And we had a Marine 3-star in Hawaii says, as long as I got a Marine on the ground, goddamn helicopters are not going to be turned off. So we kept flowing out, and I had 1 helicopter left and 2 helicopter loads at the embassy. I had 1 helicopter load at location next to Tan Son Nhut. And ironically, we had 1 helicopter, a 53A, which is an old helicopter inbound. I got all the vehicles there that were left behind in a big circle. And I said, I put a Marine in each one of the vehicles. I said, when I tell you, and this is nighttime, turn the lights on. And I told a helicopter guy to land in the middle of the lights. I had a helicopter that was capable of lifting 28 Marines, allegedly. I had 48 Marines to get out of there. And the North Vietnamese were just short of pulling through the main gate of that facility. Unfortunately, we got them all aboard the helicopter. And the South Vietnamese people were there. All the people who worked in the PXs and the clubs and the embassy, they wanted to get out too. So I was dealing with about 30,000 Vietnamese people and 1 helicopter and 48 Marines. And so they started almost trying to rush the helicopter. So I had to deal with some tough stuff. And I finally got all the Marines on that helicopter. I didn't know if we were going to get out of there. I really didn't. And the damn helicopter got up and wiggled and grunted and all that. And finally got a little forward motion going and got up above the cars. And there was a tree line not too far from us. And I didn't know if we were going to make the tree line or not. But he sort of brushed through the tree line and finally got that damn helicopter airborne. And I mean, it was loaded to the hilt. And we got another body on it. And finally got out of there. And that was the final airplane coming out of that location. And we had 2 lifts left from the American Embassy, the embassy guard to bring out of the American Embassy. And that concluded Operation Frequent Wind, the evacuation of Saigon, which was a great operation. We had Air Force helicopters aboard Hancock. We had 8 Air Force 53s, which was primarily your rescue helicopters. And we were using them also. And we pulled out and went down to Subic Bay and had all these Vietnamese aboard ships. The Filipinos wouldn't let any of them get aboard ship. We was dealing with that. We brought in old transport ships from World War II, reconfigured all this, and some of those ships had up to 20,000 Vietnamese on them. And we didn't have the facilities. They had to build head facilities, bathrooms, if you will, latrines. And I mean, it was a mess. We were throwing about 100 dead a day off those ships because there was no way we could take care of them. And we finally got all that sort of gaggled together, for lack of a better term. And I was there for about 3 days. And I got a call that says, we got a ship called the Maguez that's been taken by the Cambodians. We want you to send a contingent of Marines to take down the Maguez. And I picked Battalion XO and about 40 Marines to go land on that ship and take the ship back. But fortunately, they landed on it. The Cambodians had left the ship, and but a lot of Marines got banged up. We didn't know how to fast rope then in those days. They just absolutely jumped out of the helicopter on the deck of the ship, and a lot of them broke legs and screwed up their body. And we finally secured the ship and said it's secure. There was one phase of the Vietnam War left, and it was called Koh Tang Island. And this was occupied by the Cambodians. And we were on the way to take it, but the leadership, it was residual in Thailand, which had the operational responsibility for taking Koh Tang, said, we can't wait for you guys to get there. They brought in some Marines from Okinawa who were not properly trained, and they were aboard Air Force helicopters, and the Air Force helicopters were not used to that kind of operation. So our concluding act was at Koh Tang Island, and we got our ass handed to us and left about, 14 or 15 Marines or more on the island, and they just recovered those bodies, what was remaining in their bodies a few years ago. So that was just a sad sort of commentary to conclude that operation with. But frequent wind, RV and evac, Eagle Pull, which was the evacuation of Phnom Penh. Those operations went about as smooth as you can go. There was no issues. We only lost 2 Marines during the evacuation of Saigon, and that was a Cobra helicopter that went down. There was no helicopters of any size with a lot of people lost over a 16-hour period. Remarkable to see how capable our forces are if they'll turn us loose and let us do the job. Well, I tell you, the wartime experience, I think the positive thing that happened to me in terms of that experience is to empower people, give them authority, and give them responsibility. And that has always impacted my leadership style. Don't give people responsibility if you don't give them authority. And the biggest mistake I see in the military, even today, with some of these, what I call PowerPoint generals, is they don't know how to give people both. I see that in the business world. After I got out of the military and went into the business world. They want to tell everyone what to do, but they don't give them the authority to execute it. I always say, give the guy the job or the gal the job, and if you're going to give them the job, make sure they got the capability and get the hell out of the way. And that's my leadership style. Empower people, authority, and responsibility. Well, I appreciate the interview, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I wish you guys here, you get something I think is going to be terribly motivational for young people to come out and understand what this country has sacrificed in terms of keeping freedom for this country and for almost all the world. I look at the numbers of people who would not be free people for the 18 and 19 and 20-year-old who was willing to put it on the line. And I look at the foolishness going on in the country, and we have lost the ability of young people to identify with this country and the greatness of this country. And you see that every day in these cities all over this country. And we have not taught our kids about freedom. They think freedom is always going to be there. Freedom is, Ronald Reagan says, is one generation away. And I keep talking to young people now. I look them in the eye, and I said, are you going to be that generation?